Okay, we're back. I'm finishing up Rousseau, and again, I'm just kind of giving you these verbal preambles in the lectures. Again, for our paper, um, you're going to want to pick two of the three authors, explain their state of nature, their conception of the state of nature, and then to explain their ideal forms of government. So now we're kind of contrasting from, say, Locke in terms of what we encountered. And so in the last video, we talked about how Locke is a liberal, and he's concerned with securing individual rights, and that includes private property rights, and that's what motivates us to move out of the state of nature into a civil society. And so everything's very much focused on protecting the individual. Yeah, your individual effort goes into matter and makes it your property. And so that's what we call essentially like this kind of liberalism for Locke, is the kind of government he's trying to secure. So it's democratic, but it's democratically oriented around securing the rights of the individual. One of the critiques that Rousseau has of Locke is that essentially the Englishmen, they're voting for representatives. And so again, there's this idea with regards to liberalism is that you have these representatives that are in the judiciary, that are in the legislature, that are in the executive, in the government, and that because they're doing those things, it frees you up to go pursue your business because you're not thinking about what's the best thing for the society. You're concerned about yourself. Whereas the Rousseauian conception is very, very different. He thinks that's very, very peculiar. And so the kind of logic that Rousseau is going to be talking about then is what you're going to call republicanism, or we can call it classical republicanism. So as you encounter this material, it's imperative that you don't get confused with the way in which we use our modern parlance with regards to, say, liberal and republican, to get confused with the modern day conceptions. Here, Republican means a focus on the society or what's best for everyone, the community. And so again, this is where, though Marx would disagree, where he's critiquing Locke, he's getting a lot of these ideas about how a society should be organized from Rousseau, right? So you can kind of see like that union again with those two thinkers. And again, the American founders were, I don't know how you want to break it down, but they were very much influenced by Rousseau as well. It's kind of, okay, so again, the idea of a republic here, in the sense, isn't just an organization in terms of representatives. It was that every citizen would care about this community and participate in it. This is why, again, if you don't know this kind of history or philosophy, this is why when you look back and go, oh, it's abhorrent that you would have to have landed people be, concerned about the society. For someone like Rousseau and Locke, it didn't make sense otherwise. If you didn't have a vested interest in the society, then why would you care about it? So that's why there used to be a property requirements when you would vote. We would move past these things, but they make sense in the context. I think it's inappropriate to judge the morality of the past with the conceptions of the contemporary world. But I don't know, many of us do that, so it's fine. So where do we get this kind of ethic or this kind of Rousseauian logic about the community? Right here, is right in the beginning of the reading. He says, man was born free or is free and everywhere unchanged. So what this means is that it's just obvious that human beings, again, Rousseau is building off Aristotle, that exist as political animals, right? And so to think about us being like these autonomous individuals, like with Locke and the state of nature, makes no sense. We are in a present world, and we have to work together to solve collective problems. Okay, so this is where he's justifying his state of nature and human nature, right? So his state of nature, as compared to the other two, is he's basically saying like it ceases to exist, right? For Rousseau, you could go back to the state of nature, but that seems irrational because you would die, as we talked about before. With Locke, you can go back to the state of nature. Again, he's one of the very main people about justifying a revolution. So how could he do that? Because you could exit or break the social contract, and you still are in kind of like a decent world. And then you would come together to form a new civil society, like the Americans did from the British, that's more advantageous, that better secures their rights, because the government essentially broke the social contract. But with Rousseau, once we move out of the state of nature, it doesn't make sense to go back. And so when I teach this, I like to use this example of, again, like cave people. So imagine, we're just hunters and gatherers, and that's the state of nature. And eventually, you hunt all the rabbits and you gather all the berries. And the only way to sustain the more people that exist now is essentially through these collective works of, say, agriculture and aqueducts. And so for him, it doesn't make sense. You wouldn't go back to a worse situation. We've developed, and so you have to sustain, this kind of new reality. Okay. So again, I think he kind of factors in, like, say, time and progression of humanity, maybe perhaps better than the other two thinkers. Maybe not. So that's what he means. So you're everywhere born in chains, and the chains are political civil society. They're not necessarily oppressive, but you are chained to a community. So again, don't think of it as like say slavery, because he's actually going to do the readings very much against slavery, because he's very much for freedom. But he understands a person's relationship with their community and their government different than say Locke and Rousseau. One's an absolutist, Hobbes. I said Locke and Rousseau. One's an absolutist with Hobbes. One's a liberal, focused on the individual and securing private property rights and what individuals can do with their own property in the case of Locke. But social order is a sacred right that serves as a basis of all the others. However, the right does not come from nature. It is therefore based on convention. And so we talk about, say, tacit agreement. Convention here is just like unspoken agreement, but done in mass, right? So there are lots of things like social norms that are really just kind of we have through convention. So generally us as Americans, we're big fans of social space. We don't like people hugging us and kissing us, right? But in other parts of the world, it's very normal for people to kiss you on the cheek when they give you a greeting. Whereas a good old American handshake is what I prefer. But there's no rule, there's no law. It's just kind of convention, just kind of accepted norms. The common freedom is a consequence of man's nature. His first is to attend to his own preservation. So again, in all three, they're all kind of starting with this assumption of how do you best secure your own preservation. So life is clearly something you can never give in exchange in a social contract, right? So this is again like why someone like Rousseau thinks that again you would never agree to be like why slavery is illegitimate. You would never agree to be a slave because then your life is not yours to use autonomously. Someone else is in control of your life. So again, historically, what's interesting about the Locke is that he helped write the Virginia Charter, so he didn't think of slavery in the same way as, say, Rousseau does. So again, like the conceptions of humanity are changed, right? They literally thought of races as like distinct people, the way we would think of like Martians. Like they'd be a different race of people. We know now through science that no longer makes sense, but these are ideas that they were arguing about and contending with. So that's interesting, I think. The strongest is never strong to be. The strongest is never strong to be the master forever unless he transforms his force into right and obedience into duty. So again, Rousseau is very concerned with obedience, and again, this is kind of observation from Rousseau, which he would have read from Hobbes, which he would have read. I'm getting tired today. That you can't be the master forever. You might have enough power, but eventually, like that's not stable. You're always looking over your shoulder. So you kind of want to move into like a common, benefited, orderly society. Force is physical. I do not see what morality can result from its defects. So again, I think a better expression of why might does not make right. Yielding to force is an act of necessity, not will. So when I get robbed, I don't give the person with the gun my money because I want to. It's just that I don't want to die. So it's not morally correct. It's just it's just prudence. I want to preserve my life. At most, it is an act of prudence. There is prudence. It's in the back of my head. I hadn't even read it yet. In what sense could it be a duty, right? Let us agree, therefore, what that might does not make right, and that one is only obligated to obey legitimate powers. How do I know it's legitimate? I freely agree to it. So this is the social contract that Rousseau is talking about as well. So same ideas with different assumptions, different metaphysical backgrounds that are coming to different conceptions of humanity, human nature, human psychology, and things like that. The majority rule is itself an established convention. And presupposes unanimity at least once. So at least once, people were like, the best way to solve things. Again, this is very similar to Locke. This is why these theories historically kind of go together. Locke basically says the same thing in the notes that I have for you. That at some point you kind of realize if you're going to live together, that the fairest, best way of solving things is going to be through a majority rule. So a form of democracy, but that doesn't mean it's like the best thing. It's just you have to agree to that, say once, because it's fair to everyone. Majority rule itself, okay, so I assume that men have reached the point where obstacles of their self-preservation in the state of nature prevail by their resistance over the forces each individual can use to maintain himself in the state of nature. Okay, so that's what I've already kind of talked about. You can persist in the state of nature so long as you as an individual can overcome fighting the wolves, growing your own food. Then that primitive state can no longer subsist, and the human race would perish if it did not change its way of life. So again, think it's assumed we're not atomistic, maybe in the Lockean view, like atomistic, like an atom individualistic. We kind of live in a society, and then we grow to the point where we're going to have bonds with our family and extended kin in like these kinship networks, right? Where we have to kind of work together to solve these kind of problems, like say eating. So again, it's like this is the move. If we look back now in history, which I don't think Rousseau would have been aware of, the move from say hunter-gatherers to like people living in essentially set communities. right? So like going from hunter-gatherers to Mesopotamia. Now, since men cannot engender new forces, so there's no new technology they're going to make, except they just need more labor, but merely unite and direct existing ones. So again, we know how aquifers work or aqueducts, but it's going to take a lot of us to make a big one to have enough water for all of us to satiate the needs of the city of Rome. They have no other means for self-preservation except to form by aggregation a sum of forces that can prevail over the resistance, set them to work by a single motivation to live, and them act in concert. So again, the only way to really solve problems now isn't like can come up with new solutions. It's going to be to work together. So it's very different from, say, Locke, who's just trying to secure private property, the individual private property. It's like, no, we kind of have to work together to survive. So it's almost like a union of Locke and Hobbes, if you think. That need to survive comes back to the forefront as opposed to securing property, but attaining like a legitimate agreement where every individual would agree to that from the Locke. The republic or body politic, which its members call the state when it is passive, and sovereign when it is active. So the people, when they're just kind of living their lives, are the state. So we are the American state because we're not doing anything. We're just kind of passive. But when we use our will, collective will, that's the sovereign. So it's the same thing. It's just behaving in different ways. So those are key terms to pay attention to. It's to the contrary of nature of the body politic for the sovereign to impose on itself a law it cannot break. So again, this is very different from the Locke. There are limits set up to protect individual rights, and those are the protection of many of our natural rights. Okay, but this kind of harkens back to the Hobbes. The body politic, which is the collective body, there is no law that it can make that it cannot essentially break. And this is the classic liberal, classic Republican kind of debate, which is like, oh, well, then laws become willy-nilly perhaps. And Rousseau doesn't think so. He thinks there's a lot of implicit kind of checks and balances, whereas liberals tend to want explicit checks and balances like a written constitution. For Rousseau, that doesn't make sense. It's like, no, like because of like, say, human nature, you're going to essentially mind your own behavior because it's in your interest. So he's still thinking of self-interest, which will be more apparent in a minute, but he doesn't think you kind of need to erect these institutions to protect, say, individual liberty, because he doesn't understand why people would break it, which, again, I think it's debatable. It's just very debatable. So, again, the sovereign or the people, all of us, we can essentially change the laws when we find them necessary. Therefore, in order for the social compact not to be an ineffectual formula, it tacitly includes, so unspokenly includes, the following engagement, which alone can give force to the others. It's supposed to be they. They, whoever refuses to obey the general will, so this is an important key term I'll circle back to, shall be constrained to do so by the entire body, which means only that he will be forced to be free. So this isn't the reading, but not in our reading. So then chapter 2, if you want to go through chapter 2. Important key term to talk about that should you talk about in your papers for Rousseau is this idea of the general will. So what is the general will? It's kind of like that thing which is like the best thing for society. It's getting very Aristotelian. We somehow figure it out through conversation. It's not necessarily to the benefit of the individual. We might even think it's a negative thing in the present, but it's just this kind of anomalous idea. In the other chapters we don't read, he talks about the will of alls. The will of alls is essentially like the liberal collection of ideas, what's best for society. So every individual coming to vote and the majority rule. So again, for Rousseau, it's not even necessarily the majority will, it's the general will. It's just the general will, which is that everyone wants their preservation, promotion of their property, protection, and it's those set of things that will promote the goodness or the thriving of the society. So I hope that's kind of making sense. It's very nuanced. But again, it's not necessarily what all individuals want. It's not necessarily what the majority wants. It's just that thing in the world that would actually be to the betterment of everyone. So again, and if you don't follow the general will, you will be forced to be free. And I have other notes in here, which is like, this is kind of how Mao thought about it. You can force people to be free. So how can you relate this, or how can you guys take this and make it make sense? The example I often use is the idea of, say, like a drug addict. In a liberal society, so long as you're not hurting someone, maybe you can be a drug addict, right? So I do heroin and I just hang out and have a good time. I'm not hurting anyone. So there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that. But maybe from the general will perspective, I go, but you're not operating at full human efficiency. And if you were doing that, if you're going to school and working hard, then you could improve the society. So we're going to essentially take you, even though you're not hurting anyone, and we're going to force you to go to rehab. Okay? So that's this idea of, like, say, forcing you to be free, because now you're going to go, oh, yeah, drugs were a bad idea. it made me kind of sick and lazy, and maybe sometimes I wanted to steal things. And so now I realize that because my community forced me to go to rehab, that I have a better life. Again, this is very different. Like if you're very libertarian or anarchist, like this doesn't make sense. Like humans get to decide what makes them happy or not. And so this is this big difference. Again, other societies like say Brazil or Australia, right? You get fined if you don't vote. So I know people are very partial to voting. And it's like, well, I'm forcing you to be free, right? I'm forcing you to contribute. But it's like, what if I don't want to? What if I'm going to contribute in the wrong ways? What if I'm not informed, right? So there's just like, what does it mean to contribute to a society? And what's more important, individual freedom or the collective benefit of everyone? What is government then? An intermediate body established between the subjects and the sovereign for their mutual communication and charged with the execution of laws and the maintenance of civil as well as political freedom. So for Rousseau, government then is this kind of republican body in which we all participate, but government is this actual, essentially the executive branch. Government is essentially what fulfills the laws that we all would end up making through us always participating. So another kind of aspect that's different between the liberal thought is that I elect this government, they go do the work. I can check them when I want. I can double check to make sure they're not abusing the power, so I can vote for different people. But most of the time, I don't care. I go back and do my shipping, my trading, whatever it is that I'm doing. For Rousseau, it's just part of being a human being to always be engaged, always be paying attention, and offering opinion about what the political situation is. So again, for those of you who are not interested in politics, for Rousseau, you wouldn't have a choice. You'd have to, or else you'd be forced to be free, forced to go to a political education camp. So I think you could probably tell I'm dubious of this, but it makes a lot of sense too. And it did influence and does influence our current American political culture. Because again, there is that aspect. We do have collective problems. We do have to kind of work together, right? We're Americans, not Californians. So again, we have kind of infused this Rousseauian logic into what American political thought is today. So again, here, unlike having these three separate branches, you essentially have two separate branches. You have the people, and then you have this kind of government that could be magistrates and things of that nature that enforce the laws that the people can then change whenever they want. So there's not like a strict constitution that's very difficult to change. I therefore give the name government to the supreme administration, to the legitimate exercise of executive power. So that's the difference. The sovereign is essentially the legislature, all the people, right, when they act. They're the state when they're just kind of hanging out, being normal people. And then the government's a separate thing that's kind of this intermediate body, essentially, between the state and the sovereign. It's going to execute laws. Subjects and the sovereign. Right? Sovereign is everybody. Subjects are the people of the state. So it's this weird thing that the same thing is referred to two different aspects. This is when they act differently. Now it's kind of confusing. We can talk about that in class. There is no unique and absolute constitution of government, right? So this means that there can be any form of government that people can change their minds. They can go, we want dictatorship, we want representative government, we want a more direct democracy, but that there can be as many governments of different natures as there are states of different sizes. So again, that's really important with Rousseau. It's very interesting. Again, you're kind of stuck to this kind of constitutional liberal republic for like someone like Locke, whereas again, you can change your mind for Rousseau, and you're not breaking the social contract. Again, so his kind of social system is much more malleable. It can change depending on what the people want. So again, that it probably should strike us as a good thing because it allows the collective body, the public autonomy, to have much more freedom than say in other systems. In perfect legislation, the private or individual will should be null. So again, we're not making decisions that benefit individuals. The corporate will, he talked about when people have positions, they want to keep them. So this corporate will of government, so like legislators, is very subordinate. And consequently, the general sovereign will always dominate and the unique rule of all others. So again, he thinks this idea of the general, which I talked about, is very anomalous. It's like whatever's the benefit of everyone, not just people in a certain position and not an individual. It's everyone to everyone's benefit, which again, the liberal pushback to that is like, well, then who determines what that is, though, exactly, Rousseau? That should be your instinct when you're thinking about this kind of critical skills we've been developing throughout the semester. If people who would always govern well would not need to be governed. Keep this in mind when we read our Federalist Papers. I'm not going to talk about it. Maybe this comes back again. I'd be interested to know your guys' thoughts when I read that. So again, there's a direct connection between the founders and Rousseau. In the strict sense of the term, a true democracy, this is towards the end of the reading, a true democracy has never existed and will never exist. It is contrary to the natural order that the majority govern the minority be governed. It is unimaginable that people remain constantly assembled to attend public affairs, and it's obvious that it cannot commission to do so without changing the form of administration. So he's basically saying democracy, or this kind of direct democracy where the people are always making decisions, is problematic. And there are more examples throughout the reading. He talks about the ways in which it would work, which I think I was going to talk about if I have my book. It's away from me. But you want to know why he thinks it says a democracy fails. That might be something to talk about. And so again, all these authors, for the most part, are not keen of like this democratic system, which again, if you listen to kind of the popular rhetoric today, people just think like, oh yeah, we're more democratic, it'll solve problems. But again, like you have all these great thinkers that are very dubious of democracy. They want a kind of constrained and protected democracy. And so he's saying here, the problem is you want essentially the sovereign, the legislative power to be separate from the executive power, because when they're the same, you run into the Hobbesian problem of the absolute ruler. You're going to end up with conflict. But now it's not one person, it's essentially a majority maybe dominating a minority. And for him, it doesn't make sense. You do want administrative experts to kind of do the day-to-day tasks of government. Well, we're still have enough free time to do our own business and secure our own property, but we're always paying attention and reading about what's going on in the government. Whereas with a liberal, which is what the kind of system we have more of, right, this kind of union, right, a lot of us don't pay attention to politics, and that's what many of you are concerned with. How do I get people to pay more attention? So our system works without people always paying attention. The Rousseauian system doesn't. You're always kind of reading the paper, talking about these things. It's very Aristotelian, but the government takes care of the day-to-day business. And so again, like, it's a very interesting view. He thinks that, again, with the Aristotelian influence, you are ruled and being ruled at the same time, right, because you're both the sovereign and the state. And again, everyone might take turns into government. So at some point, you might have to be in part of government. And so for him, that's an inherent check and balance, because why wouldn't I abuse the system when I'm in the government or have a more direct rule? Because then someone else is going to come to power. And if I screw everyone over, they might screw me over. So again, he doesn't think it makes sense to hurt the body, because you're essentially hurting yourself. You're not helping the society benefit if you're taking advantage and being corrupt and things of that nature. So the paper's kind of asking us, like, does this comport to how human beings work? I mean, I'm dubious. We know human beings are corrupt. We know people oftentimes don't care if they're hurting others, even if they're in the long run hurting themselves, I think. But maybe you don't think so. Maybe you disagree with me. And I'd be really interested in reading those papers. So again, we have this kind of absolutist government, a liberal system, and a Republican system. They have different commitments and different conceptions of the state of nature. If these videos were not sufficient in helping you understand that, use outside resources to get a sense of what's going on. The Stanford Encyclopedia might be a good resource to use if you guys don't know what that is. But really ask me questions in class. That's the best opportunity for me to kind of clarify these very brief videos I'm making. I have a few more videos to do. We're going to have other readings where we just talk about them in class, where we won't have notes and we won't have videos. So again, the way to solve things in this type of format, this kind of mostly online format, is just to be as proactive as you guys can be as possible. So we've had 3 weeks of this great material. Your papers are going to be due after you've watched this video and asked me questions in class. So again, hopefully these videos make sense and I'm not mumbling over my words and my typos are problematic. So that's it for now. I'll see you guys in class in another video. So see you next time.